She knocked on his door in the middle of a storm, soaked, scared, and silent. He couldn't see her face, but he knew her pain. A blind war veteran. A woman running from a past that wouldn't let go. What happened next? It's not just a story of survival. It's a story of love, courage, and second chances you'll never forget. The mountains don't forget. That's what the old folks used to say, and Caleb Whitmore believed it. The Blue Ridge held on to every whispered prayer, every echo of gunfire, every heartbreak that had once rung through its hollows and ridges. It remembered, just like he did. In the fall of 1874, the trees blazed in red and gold while the wind whispered secrets through the naked branches. To anyone passing by, though few ever did, Caleb's cabin might have seemed like the perfect escape from a world grown too loud. But inside those hand-hewn walls, silence wasn't peace. It was a sentence, 3 years. That's how long it had been since Caleb lost his sight to Confederate shrapnel at Fredericksburg. One moment, he was a soldier, young, certain, burning with purpose. The next, everything went black. The darkness never left, and neither did the war. He came back to Raven's Hollow a different man, eyes clouded, soul bruised, spirit somewhere between alive and merely surviving. The cabin, built by his grandfather, became both refuge and prison. His life was a litany of routine: wake before dawn, feed the chickens, split firewood, touch each wall and know exactly where everything was because nothing ever changed. It couldn't. Change meant chaos. Change meant risk. Every morning, he brewed 2 mugs of coffee. He always drank one. The second, he let sit, cooling quietly on the table, untouched. A strange ritual, maybe foolish, but it made him feel like someone might show up one day, someone worth making coffee for. His only companion was Scout, a gray-muzzled shepherd with eyes that missed nothing, and a loyalty forged in shared silence. Caleb had never trained him, not really. The dog just understood. When to lead, when to nudge, when to sit in the quiet and not ask for more than Caleb could give. Folks in town whispered about the blind man in the hills, the war hero turned recluse. Some called him tragic. Others said he was just stubborn. But none of them knew how hard it was to close your eyes at night and see only fire, blood, and faces you couldn't save. Then, one night, the storm came. It began like most mountain storms, sudden and fierce. The sky cracked open without warning. Wind howled through the trees like a pack of wolves. Rain hit the roof like angry fists. Caleb had been sitting by the hearth, Scout dozing at his feet, when he heard it. A knock. Not thunder, not the creak of a shutter. A knock, twice. He froze. Visitors were rare, unexpected ones practically unheard of. "Who's there?" His voice, rarely used except to speak to Scout or himself, sounded hoarse. A pause. Then a woman's voice, low and uncertain, but clear. "My name is Evelyn Monroe. I'm sorry to intrude. My wagon stuck down the road. I didn't know where else to go." Caleb's heart kicked against his ribs. He stood, moving slowly, hand tracing the wall until it reached the door. Scout was already there, alert and still. When he opened the door, cold wind slammed into him, carrying with it the scent of rain, earth, and something floral. Lavender. She stood there, soaked through, trembling but not broken. A stranger. A woman. Alone. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand explanations. He simply stepped aside. "Come in." She crossed the threshold, dripping and breathless. Her presence filled the room like candlelight, soft but undeniable. She moved cautiously, careful not to disturb anything, but to Caleb, even her silence sounded different, like warmth in winter, like hope in shadow. "I can light the fire," she offered, her voice closer now. "I've got it," he said, already striking a match by muscle memory. The sulfur smell flared, and a flame flickered to life. As the fire grew, so did the strangeness of the moment. Caleb, who hadn't shared his home with another soul in 3 long years, now sat across from a woman who hadn't planned to be here. And yet, something in the air said she was meant to be. Neither of them spoke for a while. Scout curled back into his spot, accepting her presence as if she'd always belonged. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, something stirred. Something that hadn't stirred in Caleb since before the battlefield stole his sight, an ache that wasn't pain, but possibility. He didn't know who Evelyn Monroe really was, or what she was running from, but he would soon, and nothing, not blindness, not fear, not the past, would ever be the same again. Evelyn Monroe sat near the fire, steam rising from her sodden cloak, clutching a mug of hot coffee as though it were her last defense against the world. The heat flushed color back into her cheeks, but there was something deeper still, something in her eyes that made Caleb feel like she wasn't just cold. She was haunted. She glanced at him across the room. "You saved my life tonight." Caleb shook his head slowly. "I only opened a door. Sometimes that's all it takes." It was quiet after that. Outside, the storm moaned against the cabin walls, wind twisting through trees like a warning. But inside, the fire crackled and hissed, a lullaby of warmth and light. Caleb, without needing sight, could sense the way Evelyn's shoulders softened with each sip, the way her breath slowed, steadied. She was safe, for now. She began to speak, hesitantly at first. She told him she was from Charleston, that she'd been on the road for days, heading for Staunton, where, she claimed, distant cousins lived. But even as the words left her lips, Caleb could tell she was only giving him the edges of the truth. Her voice betrayed more than it revealed. There was pain in her pauses, fear between every line. He didn't push. He'd learned during the war that sometimes the kindest thing you could do for a hurting soul was to sit quietly and let them talk, or not talk, at their own pace. Instead, he shared pieces of himself, of Scout, of the mountain, of the years he'd spent alone since returning blind from Fredericksburg. When Evelyn finally looked up, her voice was softer. "How did you learn to live again?" "I didn't," Caleb said. "Not really. I just didn't die. Sometimes that's enough." She nodded slowly, and the firelight caught the glint of tears in her eyes. "That's what I've been doing, too." They sat together through the heart of the storm, speaking in turns and silences. She asked about the dog, and Caleb told her how Scout had once led him down a mountainside in thick fog after a misstep. "He sees for me," he said. "Sometimes better than I ever did with eyes." She chuckled, a soft, tired sound. "I could use someone like that." "You're welcome to borrow him, but I warn you, he's picky about who he listens to." Scout, as if understanding, let out a low sigh from his post by the fire and nudged his nose closer to Evelyn's boot. Later, she helped wash the few dishes they used. She moved gently, describing her actions as she went, where she set the pot, how she arranged the utensils. Caleb noticed the care she took in every motion, and not just for his sake. It was how she treated the world, as something fragile and worth noticing. Before she went to the guest room, she paused at the edge of the hallway. "I don't know how long I'll stay," she said, "but thank you, Caleb, for making space for me." He tilted his head. "I think this place has been waiting for you longer than I have." When the door clicked shut behind her, Caleb sat by the fire again, his fingers resting on Scout's warm fur. The house, once full of only echoes, now felt like it had a heartbeat again. He didn't know who Evelyn Monroe truly was. He didn't know why she ran or from whom, but he knew this. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man waiting to die. The fire had burned low, but Caleb stayed seated, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the mantel. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the hush of falling snow. He thought about Evelyn's hands as they moved, competent, careful, and used to doing more than they should have to. They were hands that had worked through storms before. He could feel it. In the quiet, memories crept in. Not just of war, but of laughter he hadn't heard in so long he'd nearly forgotten the sound. He remembered the scent of lavender from her dress. Unexpected, comforting. A scent not of fear, but of someone trying to hold on to dignity even when everything else had slipped away. And maybe that's what struck him most. She didn't ask for help. She'd come to his door because she had no other choice, but even then, she carried herself with a strange sort of grace, like someone determined not to break, even if all that kept her upright was sheer will. As Caleb banked the fire for the night, his hand brushed the second mug of coffee on the table. Still there, still full. Tomorrow, he thought, he might pour her a cup before she asked. Maybe she'd drink it. Maybe she wouldn't. But for the first time in 3 years, he wouldn't drink alone. He whispered goodnight into the dark, not expecting a reply, but from down the hall came her voice, faint but certain. "Good night, Caleb." And just like that the cabin breathed, not walls, not wood, not stone, but something alive, something shared. Evelyn Monroe had arrived in a storm, but she'd brought more than wet clothes and mystery. She'd brought air to a man who'd forgotten how to breathe. And though neither of them knew it yet, everything was about to change. When Evelyn Monroe stepped into Caleb Whitmore's cabin, neither of them knew just how long she'd stay. It began with a single night, then another. Caleb didn't ask her to leave, and Evelyn never said when she'd go. There was something unsaid between them, fragile but persistent, like the first green shoot pushing through thawing soil, delicate yet determined to grow. In those first days, their lives were tentative orbits slowly pulling closer. Evelyn swept the floor without being asked, sorted through the clutter on the shelves, and even found a tin of tea leaves tucked behind jars of dried beans. Caleb, in turn, began waking earlier than usual, not out of necessity, but anticipation. There was conversation now in the quiet dawns. The morning light brought more than warmth, it brought companionship. She asked questions, not the kind meant to pry, but the kind that showed she noticed. How do you tell when the hens need feeding? How do you find your way to the woodpile? Caleb found himself explaining routines he had long stopped thinking about. And in that explaining, he rediscovered how much he had learned to live in the dark, and how much he had lost while doing it. One morning, Evelyn followed him out to the garden patch behind the house. The frost had just begun to lift, revealing rows of neglected soil and tangled weeds. Caleb had done what he could to keep it alive, but it had become more memory than harvest. "It needs care," she said gently, "but I think there's still life here. I wasn't sure if it was worth the trouble." She looked at him then, and her voice was soft but certain. "Everything alive is worth the trouble." They spent hours kneeling in the dirt together, Evelyn guiding Caleb's hands to tender shoots and hidden roots. She described each leaf, each bud, with the precision of a botanist and the affection of someone remembering a long-lost friend. Her voice painted pictures more vividly than any artist ever could. As days passed, they built new rhythms. Caleb would chop wood in the morning, while Evelyn prepared meals, filling the cabin with scents he'd nearly forgotten. She made stew from root vegetables and wild herbs, baked biscuits so light they seemed to float from pan to plate. He hadn't realized how much hunger he'd buried, not just for food, but for warmth, for the feeling of being cared for. Evelyn began reading aloud at night. She found a stack of old books Caleb's sister had left behind, volumes of poetry, stories of explorers and faraway lands. Her voice, even in the most mundane passages, was soothing. Caleb would sit in his worn armchair, Scout curled at his feet, and let the words carry him places his eyes no longer could. One evening, as twilight draped the mountains in dusky blue, Evelyn paused in her reading. "Do you ever wish you could see again?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Sometimes, but not for the reasons most folks think. I don't miss the colors or the faces. I miss reading her expression. I miss knowing if someone's lying, or if they're about to cry." Evelyn's voice trembled slightly. "And what do you hear now when you listen to me?" Caleb turned toward her. "I hear a woman who's trying not to fall apart, who's strong because she has to be, and tired of being strong alone." She didn't reply, but that night when she said goodnight, her voice held something new. Not just gratitude, trust. A week later, she surprised him with a gift. "Hold out your hand," she said. He felt a small wooden box, carved smooth at the edges. "I found it in the attic, thought it was broken, fixed the hinge and cleaned it up." Inside, neatly folded, were sprigs of dried lavender. "For your shelf," she said. "I thought the cabin could use a bit of color, even if only I can see it." The gesture moved him more than he could say. He didn't need to see the lavender. He remembered its scent from the night she arrived. They began keeping a journal together. Evelyn wrote in longhand, describing each day, the weather, their work, little things that might otherwise be forgotten. Caleb added thoughts aloud while she transcribed, a shared record of two lives slowly knitting together. Sometimes Caleb would catch her staring out the window, her eyes far away. Once he asked, "Do you miss Charleston?" She shook her head. "Not the place, just the idea of safety, of home." "And do you feel safe here?" She looked at him and smiled. For the first time in years. That night it snowed lightly, covering the garden with a soft white blanket. Evelyn stood on the porch, arms folded against the chill, watching the world turn clean again. Caleb joined her, one hand on Scout's back, the other lightly brushing hers. "There's something peaceful about snow," she said, "like it's giving the world another chance." "Do you believe in second chances?" She took a deep breath. "I want to." And so they built something new, not with blueprints or declarations, but with small moments stacked like stones in a quiet foundation. A meal shared. A story read aloud. A laugh, unexpected and honest. The kind of bond that doesn't announce itself, but is undeniable once it's there. Neither of them said the word love. But it lingered, unspoken, in the steam rising from a cup of tea, in the rustle of pages turned gently beside a fire. It echoed in the walls of a cabin that had once been too quiet, and now held the breath and warmth of two souls learning to live again. And though winter crept closer, the air inside Caleb Whitmore's cabin only grew warmer. There are some shadows that don't stretch with the sun. They live in the corners of a person's heart, tucked away behind smiles, folded into the way a person sets a cup down, or the hush in their breath before sleep. Evelyn Monroe had learned to live with those shadows. She didn't speak of them, not directly. Instead, she folded them into fresh biscuits and warm tea, buried them under garden rows and mended shirts. They softened in her voice as she read aloud and flickered behind her eyes when she paused too long between sentences. But Caleb Whitmore, though blind, saw them as clearly as if they stood in the light. He'd felt them circling her since the moment she stepped through his door. They had a scent, a silence, a shape. And although she never told him what haunted her, he knew that something, or someone, had driven her to his cabin like wind drives leaves to shelter. What he didn't know was how soon that past would follow. It began, as danger often does, not with a bang, but a whisper. Caleb had gone down the mountain into Staunton, as he did once a month, to trade wood and eggs. He hated leaving Evelyn alone, even for a day. Lately, there was something brittle in the air, a tension neither of them could name. At the general store, the clerk, a man who'd known Caleb since boyhood, lowered his voice as he handed over a sack of flour. Had a stranger in town yesterday, asking questions. Said he was looking for a woman named Evelyn Monroe. Sounded urgent, sounded off. Caleb said nothing, but his hands gripped the sack tighter. What kind of man? Tall, clean clothes, too clean, like he bought them to play cowboy. Spoke soft, but there was steel in his tone. Didn't like being told no. He's not here for a reunion, Caleb. The ride home was longer than usual. He heard every hoofbeat echo like thunder. Every gust of wind felt like a warning. When he reached the cabin, Evelyn met him with her usual smile, but Caleb could tell something inside her already knew. He didn't tell her what the clerk said. Instead, he handed her the sugar she'd requested and chopped wood until his back ached. That night, as she read by firelight, Caleb sat quietly, memorizing the cadence of her voice, knowing peace was slipping away. 2 days later, the storm came, not of rain or snow, but of reckoning. It was late afternoon. Evelyn and Caleb were sitting on the porch, their chairs angled toward the quiet forest. Scout lay at their feet, ears twitching. Then came the sound. Hooves on gravel, steady and purposeful. Evelyn tensed beside him. Scout growled low. 3 men appeared through the thinning trees, riding slowly, like ghosts returning to finish something they'd started. They dismounted a few yards from the porch. The tallest approached first. Even without eyes, Caleb felt his presence, the smug certainty of a man who believed everything he touched belonged to him. "Evelyn," the man said. His voice was as polished as it was poisonous. She rose. Her hands were trembling, but her chin didn't lower. "Thomas, you've caused me quite a bit of trouble." Caleb stood beside her. "You're not welcome here." Thomas's eyes slid toward Caleb, then back to Evelyn. "This doesn't concern you, old man. She's my wife." Evelyn's voice cut through the cold. "Not anymore." Silence, then a movement, too fast. One of the men reached for his pistol, but Scout leapt with a growl that shook the ground. The gun fired wild. Caleb moved on instinct, grabbing Evelyn and pushing her behind him. His hand found the porch rail, then a rusty shovel he'd left from the morning's work. What followed was chaos. Shouts, blows, the clatter of hooves as one man fled. Caleb swung with the strength of a younger man, every muscle remembering war. Evelyn, never one to freeze, grabbed the poker from beside the stove and struck out with a fierceness born of years held back. By the time the sheriff arrived, called by a neighbor who'd seen the strangers ride up, 2 of the men lay bloodied in the snow. Thomas stood, disarmed, glaring not with power, but shame. His gaze met Evelyn's one final time. "You'll regret this," he snarled. But Evelyn, breathless, cheeks streaked with tears and triumph, stood taller than she ever had. "I already regret the years I gave you." The sheriff nodded grimly. "We'll be taking them to the jailhouse. Don't expect they'll see daylight soon." As the riders were hauled away, Caleb and Evelyn stood in the doorway. The wind tugged at her skirts, and her hands were still shaking. Caleb guided her to the steps, sitting beside her in the growing dusk. "I should have told you sooner," she whispered. I thought if I didn't speak it, it couldn't find me." He reached for her hand. "You don't owe me anything, Evelyn, not even your story." But she told him anyway. She told him of a marriage built on fear, not love, of nights when silence was safer than words, of mornings when bruises were hidden beneath high collars and polite smiles, of the day she walked out the door and never looked back. Not because she was brave, but because she'd run out of fear. "I didn't know where I was going," she said, "just that I couldn't stay." "And now?" Caleb asked. She looked at him, her eyes bright with tears and fire. "Now I want to stay more than I want to breathe." The fire inside the cabin still crackled, untouched. They didn't need its warmth. There was something stronger between them now, something earned. That night they sat until the stars came out, saying little. But everything had changed. The danger had passed, yes, but so had something else. For the first time, Evelyn was not just a guest in Caleb's home. She was a part of it, a part of him. And while her past had come to reclaim her, it had failed, because she was no longer that woman, and Caleb was no longer alone. Some victories are not shouted from rooftops. They are whispered on porches, held in the spaces between breath and touch. And this, they both knew, was just the beginning. It was a quiet morning when everything changed again, but this time the stillness didn't come with dread. Instead, it arrived like a whisper of peace. After the chaos, after the storm of the past had come and gone, the cabin in Blue Ridge seemed to exhale, as if the very walls recognized that something new was beginning. For Caleb Whitmore, who had learned to live without sight, and Evelyn Monroe, who had learned to live without safety, the morning sun felt like a promise. Caleb woke early, as he always did, but today he didn't rush to his chores. He lingered in bed for a few extra minutes, listening to the rhythm of Evelyn's soft breathing from the next room. Scout stirred by the fireplace, then padded to his side, nudging his hand gently. Caleb whispered, "It's a good day, Scout." And for the first time in years he believed it. In the kitchen, Evelyn moved with a grace that had become second nature. She hummed softly as she prepared breakfast. An old hymn, maybe, or something her mother used to sing. The scent of warm bread filled the cabin, mingling with the soft crackle of the fire and the crispness of the mountain air filtering through the window. Over breakfast, they didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Evelyn poured his coffee the way he liked it, just a touch of honey. Caleb passed her the butter before she asked. It was the kind of ease that only comes when two people have walked through fire and emerged, not untouched, but still standing. Later, they stood outside, side by side on the porch. Snow had melted in patches, revealing damp earth and the stubborn tips of green shoots poking through. Caleb tilted his face toward the sun, smiling faintly. "You know," Evelyn said, "this place used to feel like a hiding spot." "It did," Caleb replied, "for me too. But now," she continued, "it feels like a beginning." Caleb nodded. "It is." They spent the day tending to the land together. The garden they had nurtured in silence now bore the first signs of spring. Evelyn knelt in the soil, her hands steady, planting seeds with quiet determination. Caleb, guided by her voice and the firmness of Scout's lead, hauled water from the well, repaired the broken gate, mended the chicken coop. The work was hard, but it wasn't a burden. It was a gift, a way to shape something lasting from the fragile bond that had taken root between them. As they worked, neighbors came. Not many, but enough to remind them that the world hadn't forgotten them. Mrs. Langley from down the ridge brought apple preserves. Her grandson helped chop wood. Even the sheriff stopped by just to say hello and to make sure Evelyn was truly safe. She was. At dusk, Evelyn and Caleb returned to the porch, their hands tired, their hearts full. The sky turned lavender and gold, washing the mountains in hues that Caleb couldn't see, but could feel in the way Evelyn described them. "Looks like a painting," she murmured. He smiled. "Then paint it for me." And so she did. With words, with her breath, with the way she held his hand as they watched the light fade. Inside, they read together by lantern light. Evelyn had found an old journal in the attic, Caleb's mother's, filled with stories and recipes and half-finished poems. They took turns, Evelyn reading aloud, Caleb reciting the parts he remembered from years past. It was like stitching the past and present together, mending something long torn. Afterward, they sat quietly. Evelyn turned toward him. "Do you ever think we were meant to find each other?" Caleb considered the question, then nodded. "I don't know about fate, but I do know I wasn't living until you knocked on my door." She reached for his hand, folding her fingers around his. "I don't want to leave," she said. "You don't have to." There was a long silence. Then, softly, she added, "I don't think I ever really belonged anywhere until now." He turned his head toward her, sensing the weight of the moment. "Then let's make it ours. This place. This life." It wasn't a proposal in the way most people would recognize, but it was more honest than any ring or vow. It was a promise born from fire and survival, from darkness and healing. The next morning, the sun rose over Blue Ridge with a brilliance that bathed the valley in gold. Evelyn stood by the window, watching it climb, her eyes reflecting the dawn. Caleb stood beside her, blind to the view but not to the warmth in her hand, and together they stepped forward, not into a perfect life, but into one that was real and shared and new. A new dawn had come, and this time they would not face it alone. A new dawn in Blue Ridge. From the first moment Evelyn Monroe knocked on Caleb Whitmore's door, their story was never truly about survival. It was about remembrance, resilience, and rebirth. The journey of a blind war veteran and a haunted woman fleeing from her past wasn't marked by grand gestures or sweeping declarations, but by quiet moments, steady presence, and the slow mending of broken spirits. Their tale reminds us that healing isn't loud, it's gentle, it's patient. It begins with a knock, a shared meal, and the willingness to let someone stay. Caleb had lived in silence for 3 long years, blinded by war, surrounded by ghosts, and wrapped in a routine that dulled the ache but never soothed it. His world was shaped by memory, by the scent of firewood, the scrape of tin mugs, the sound of Scout's steady breath. He had resigned himself to solitude until Evelyn appeared in the rain, a figure from the storm who would reshape his future with the simple power of presence. Evelyn, too, carried her shadows. Her silence came not from blindness, but from fear, a life defined by control, pain, and flight. She arrived with no clear plan, only a desperate hope that the road might lead her somewhere safe. What she found was not just shelter, but understanding. In Caleb's cabin, she found the space to exhale, to listen to her own voice, and to be heard for the first time in years. What began as refugee became routine. 2 strangers growing into a rhythm, planting seeds, literally and emotionally. Evelyn brought life to Caleb's world, sweeping floors, reading aloud, planting gardens. Caleb, in turn, gave her something rarer than safety, trust. He listened without judgment, responded without pressure. Their love grew not from romance but from routine, from consistency, from shared silence and mutual respect. And then, the past returned. It always does. Evelyn's former husband, Thomas, came not seeking reconciliation but control. What followed was not just a confrontation, it was a reckoning. For Evelyn, standing up to him wasn't just about safety. It was a declaration of identity. She was no longer the woman who cowered, no longer the wife defined by survival. She was someone new, someone who could fight back, someone who chose her life. And Caleb, blind but never broken, stood by her, not as a savior, but as a partner. When danger came, he moved by instinct, defending the home they had built together, not with strategy, but with soul. From that moment, Evelyn was no longer a guest. She was part of the home, part of Caleb, part of a future not yet spoken aloud, but deeply felt. They didn't need marriage vows to affirm their bond. Their connection was forged in fire, silence, and second chances. Together, they turned the Blue Ridge cabin into a sanctuary, not just for themselves, but for their memories, their shared laughter, their stories. The land responded too. Green shoots rising, neighbors returning, community reshaping. So what do we learn from Caleb and Evelyn's journey? We learn that healing begins when we stop running, that safety doesn't always arrive with fanfare. It arrives quietly, in the form of a warm mug of coffee, a steady hand, a place to rest without fear. We learn that love doesn't require sight or perfection. It requires presence, patience, the courage to stay. And we learn that second chances are not given. They're made, with each choice to trust, with each risk to speak, with each day you wake up and decide not to give up on yourself or on someone else. Evelyn and Caleb's story is not just a Wild West tale. It's a reminder for all of us today that in a world still so often loud with judgment and quick to walk away, we must choose to stay, to listen, to see, even when our eyes fail us, to hold out our hands and say, "You are safe here." Their love wasn't perfect, but it was real. And in the quiet strength of their bond, we find a blueprint for what it means to rebuild, not just a life, but a heart. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that love can begin again in the most unexpected places, that silence can become sanctuary, that even broken things can bloom, then help us continue telling these stories. Subscribe to Wild West Legends. Your support gives life to more stories like Caleb and Evelyn's, tales not just of frontier grit, but of emotional truth, quiet bravery, and the power of choosing each other when it matters most. Because out here, in the vast heart of the West, every sunrise is a second chance, and every story, no matter how scarred, deserves to be told. Thank you for riding with us. Until next time, stay brave, stay kind, and always believe in the power of beginning again.